For this week's call out, we interview retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman and discuss his new book and also how, over the past few decades, a short term transactional approach to international relationships, as opposed to a long term values based approach, has really sold American interests short. I hope you enjoyed the interview, and remember to subscribe, like on YouTube or your podcast platform, because that really helps the show out. We're joined today by retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, who recently released a new book, The Folly of Realism: How the West Deceived Itself About Russia and Betrayed Ukraine. Many may recognize him from when he testified before the House Intelligence Committee as a part of the impeachment inquiry into then President Donald Trump, who's current President Donald Trump, but during the first term. Alex, first off, congratulations on the success of your recent book, which has been deemed an instant New York Times bestseller, as well as your earlier book, Here, Right Matters, which was also a New York Times bestseller. And thank you for coming on with us and for your courage and patriotism in what are definitely worrisome times for many people. I wanted to start, just kind of we know you released a new book. We've seen you do the media tour and so forth. And it's been, very interesting, very engaging. The book itself is fascinating. But we note that the book takes aim at U.S. policy towards Russia over several decades, 6 presidential administrations. So it certainly challenges a lot of conventional thinking and could ruffle a lot of feathers, So has anything surprised you in the public's reaction to the book, and coming from any angle?
Yeah. It's interesting. Putting it in those terms, I guess I take a relatively provocative approach, but it's because the consequences of the mistakes has been so disastrous and so destabilizing. It's cost so many lives, and the risks are, we're managing them to a certain extent, but the risks are actually could very well amplify and have reverberations around the world. Think about like how this might encourage China to wage war in Taiwan, and what the U.S. response could be. We could be looking at something that precipitates a much bigger world war. So yes, I take issue with the way we conducted ourselves across 6 administrations. I basically look at this relationship between the U.S., Russia, Ukraine, the West really with Russia and Ukraine, and there are some consistent mistakes that we make. We buy into this Russian narrative about how they're a great and singular nation based on their size, or based on their military capability, or based on their nuclear arsenal, or based on their history that they tell about themselves, that they're entitled to these countries because of the fact that they dominated them, conquered them, and had an empire. So those that buy into the exceptionalism forced us to look for kind of very, very small, in a lot of ways irrelevant, most of the time, wins, just to keep Russia engaged, keep them on sides. There were some notable wins that were meaningful that we should have pursued, like arms control, reducing the nuclear arsenal, the New START treaties, and things of that nature. Those were important, but then there were plenty of things that were meaningless. Like, we try to engage them on climate change, which they weren't interested in, or that global war on terror, which in fact, not only were they not interested in, but they actually put bounties on U.S. soldiers eventually in Afghanistan. So much for, George Bush looking into Putin's soul and looking into his eyes and seeing his soul. The guy put bounties on U.S. soldiers. And then the other thing was misplaced fears. The fact that we were always kind of prey to these fears that Russia, we needed to manage this relationship very, very carefully. And if we were too provocative, too condemnatory, too conditional, that could break the relationship, and yielding ground consistently to the point where Russia was encouraged to push further, graduating from mischief making to hybrid warfare. So this would be like interference in elections or kind of cyber warfare, and ultimately to military aggression. So I guess in taking this kind of relatively aggressive position, laying out this really comprehensive case, looking at the way we conducted ourselves, I thought that there would be more pushback from policymakers, from administrations. And I think that this is partially because folks like Michael McFaul, who's a friend of mine, was part of the mistakes that were made early on. Let's say in the Obama administration, um, with reset in in the first administration. Um, but now he's turned into probably more of a hawk because he understands that Russia can't be kind of coddled.
Yeah.
You need to demonstrate resolve. And I believe that the other presidents and other leaders that I kind of point out where they may have fallen short kind of recognize that too. So they've come around. The other thing is that the theoretical basis of this book, the title, "The Folly of Realism," takes
Yeah.
issue with a whole school of thought.
Mm-hmm.
Realism, which says that all nations pursue their national interests, not values, but national interests exclusively and maximally, and that everything becomes a transaction.
Yeah.
And I pick fights with some of the heavyweights, and so far I haven't really had to take that much heat for that.
Mm.
Interestingly enough, where I think I'm cautious and thoughtful. I do some policy making, also recommendations around neo-idealism, and
Mm.
it's a little bit of an uncomfortable spot because I think my thinking is substantive. It is grounded in the fact that what we've done so far doesn't work, and we need a different approach. And I talk about this idea of neo-idealism, but I think there's a lot more work to be done in this idea. I think the fundamental premise is sound.
Mm-hmm.
The fundamental premise is that we should be acting on our interests, acting on our values.
Yeah.
Values should be front and center. The reason is that it allows us to look past these bright, shiny objects, these hopes and fears, and act on something long term.
Yeah.
Act on building relationships with fellow democracies because they provide us security. They're our most robust trading partners. But I think there's more to be done in this space. How do you define this school of thought? And we have a few years because nothing's going to happen under Trump.
Yeah.
I think I'll put some additional thought. Maybe some other scholars could weigh in, and then we put together an idea that allows us to rebalance the scales, correct for this ultimately highly transactional approach from Trump to something that allows us to recapture moral leadership and be consistent and long-sighted.
No, that's it. And I asked that question specifically because you propose or you attack some pretty established status quo thoughts and like you said, policymakers and so forth. And so that's interesting. That I mean, it might be that the things you're pointing out are things that if you look at it and say, okay, yeah, maybe we were looking at this at all of this time was not the way that we should. Like, at least now with the benefit of hindsight, we can see, okay, maybe maybe this guy's onto something.
Yeah.
so Tunde, you had something?
I've got a quick follow-up, Alex. That's great. And I wanted to ask you, because like I said, when we were talking offline, I do have a lot of people, like friends of mine in my personal life that, they've just been exposed to various narratives. And so I'd like to hear from you, like I'm thinking of the kind of saying that the first casualty of war is truth, right? And so I've heard from some of just my personal friends and things when we get in this discussion is, well, Putin was justified in invading Ukraine because, the West and NATO have been breaking all these treaties and they keep encroaching, that closer and closer to the Russian border, so on and so forth. And, people want to pick certain dates in the last 20, 30 years of when things might have been agreed to or not. And so usually my comeback is, it's interesting that you seem to only have information of one side of who broke treaties and when. Have you ever thought to ask, how did Russia deal with treaties coming out of the early 90s, things like that? And, so maybe speaking to that as to why does it matter? Why should we care about the West, trying to promote democracies in Central Europe, things like that? Because I think that's where we need a little bit more conversation of the why. Why does any of this matter? Why are we protecting this small country?
So that's a big question. I'm going to do the early part about the narratives about who's at fault first, and then if I wander too much, you remind me to talk about the big question about why it matters. Look, the Russians have consistently been pretty darn bad actors. people forget about the fact that in the early 90s, along with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the formation of these 15 different republics, the Russians played the role of the instigators to continue to influence and dominate the region by driving what are referred to, by a lot of people as or experts as frozen conflicts. So think about, right now there are Russian peacekeepers in Moldova, this tiny country sandwiched between Romania and Ukraine. It was a breakaway region. You had more Russian-speaking folks, and the Russians, so they try to separate, and the Russians basically came in and bolstered them. Or in Georgia with two breakaway regions, Ossetia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, or Nagorno-Karabakh, this confrontation that occurred between Azerbaijan and Armenia. The Russians played roles in all these things. So those are pretty big in those countries. Those were defining. They kind of shaped the early independence period and exacerbated the massive challenges of transforming from communist authoritarian to democracies, arrested those kinds of movements. But those are pretty big highlights. But along the way, you got the two Chechen wars that the Russians were involved in, where they absolutely leveled Chechnya and the city of Grozny, the capital. They've threatened on multiple occasions this idea of the fact that Crimea was Russian territory, signaling that in the 90s. And then in 2003, there was fire exchange on the split, like little island not too far away from Crimea, between Russia and Crimea and Ukraine. There were these episodes all along the way in which the Russians basically, said one thing and did something completely different. So, multiple different agreements with these countries that were broken, multiple different agreements with the United States, violations of like the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which we ultimately withdrew from in the first Trump administration. Tons of these things, just constantly, saying one thing, knowing that the good actors on the other side of the equation were bound by their, kind of their word, their ethics, their values, their national interests to be predictable and stable and reliable, and the Russians could just do whatever they want. It's the same if you think about it in the context of the United States. The Dems, to a certain extent, have to hold the values and principles and the truth, and the Russian and the Republicans, especially MAGA, could lie with impunity. Yeah. So that's the environment that you're kind of looking at, specifically with regards to this idea of NATO and enlargement. There's this claim that the Russians received assurances that NATO wouldn't advance east, which is an interesting idea. Coming out of the fact that the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia and the Soviet Union were the biggest losers, right? You have all these different countries emerge out of the Warsaw Pact. You have all these countries emerge out of the Soviet Union. The West and the United States still were gracious victors. They were like, let's take into consideration the Russians. We want them to join the community of nations. We want them to be a fellow democracy. We want them to be a market economy capitalist. So we're going to be very, very gracious. And we're going to take their thoughts into consideration. The Russians at the time were making this argument about pan-European security, how important Russia could be as a stabilizing force, contributing to European security, and we did that. We extended the hand of friendship and things of that nature. Even as the Russians demonstrated themselves to be not truly reformed and kind of again graduating through the different steps towards military aggression. The Clinton administration was particularly very sensitive to the way they conducted the enlargement in the 90s. They basically waited until the late 1990s, even though there was a massive clamor from the Eastern Europeans that knew it was a matter of time before Russia was going to be aggressive. The Eastern Europeans had to live with it. They were occupied for decades by the Soviet Union. So they were clamoring. The Poles were at one point making noises about developing their own nuclear arsenal as a hedge against Russian aggression. So we didn't just simply do it out of the kindness of our hearts. We did because these countries asked to us, to welcome them into NATO. But we also did it because of hard-nosed interest calculations that we didn't want them to, to take a much more radical approach. So we did something that served these countries' demands and the mutual interests.
So hold on.
Um,
I just want to be clear. You're saying that those countries, those satellites, former Soviet satellites of Russia, wanted to go and be more and caucus more with the West. They did not
Absolutely,
want to.
they
They felt
clamored.
that the Soviet Union, when it was the Soviet Union, was basically holding them hostage in a sense,
It
and
was,
that
and
was
they
after the
thought
Warsaw Pact of
that's right.
Second World War. That they were
That's
just
and they
forced to be part of that
right, and
Soviet
they
Union.
thought that
Yeah.
the Russians, in a moment of weakness, couldn't control them, couldn't
Yeah.
prevent them
Yeah,
from
exactly. So
getting
this was
there.
their chance to break away, like a bad relationship. This is my
Yeah,
chance to run out, yeah, and
right,
then leave.
right.
So, and then you said something very important, because I think this is important for us Americans to appreciate when you said they wanted to have exposure to market economies and capitalism,
Yeah.
and maybe you can go into what's the relationship between representative governments or democracies, whatever we can say,
Yeah,
pluralistic societies that are more
yeah,
open versus, let's say, Russia and other nations like that that are more autocratic, that have the same leader for 2 or 3 generations,
yeah.
potentially. Um,
And
why is it
economies
that
that
those
oftentimes are
economies,
more patronage based, or
Yeah.
that
yeah,
are
exactly, with the corruption, why is
market
it that those
based and so
economies
forth?
don't tend to be the ones that we have traditionally wanted to ally with?
Yeah, a lot of important questions. I just want to put a period on the question about NATO enlargement and who's the
Mm.
provocateur.
Yeah.
Um, so those countries closest to Russia were some of the first to be invited. Ukraine was excluded because we thought it was too provocative to invite Ukraine. So the last time that any NATO enlargement occurred was really in the 2000s, decades
Yeah.
ago. And all the other enlargement occurred kind of in the Balkans and other parts of Ukraine. So the justification that Russia felt threatened and had to take action is pretty absurd when you don't have when the casus belli, the precipitating factor occurred a long time ago. So to me, it's absolutely crystal clear. You have to take Putin's word for it. He talks about the fact that Ukraine is not a valid country. He talks about the fact that it is part of Russia. It is essential that Ukraine be folded back into Russia, and you don't have to kind of. There are folks that spin different narratives to advance their own views. Maybe anti-war views, or don't think the U.S. should be supporting Ukraine. But if you listen to what Putin says himself, it's pretty crystal clear. Now, with regards to why we have relationships we do, I mean, I think the story that we have with our allies, the closest allies, is we have shared values, fellow democracies, believe in individual liberties, protecting human rights. We have shared interests because we understand this is a dangerous world, and there are authoritarian regimes that believe in the rules of the jungle, and that we want to um, advance the notions of free trade. Sometimes this doesn't always align because there was a gap between us and some of our closest allies on threat perceptions. Like
Yeah.
the Eastern Europeans believed that the Russians were much more robust and near threat than the Western Europeans, because the Western Europeans didn't have to live under Russian domination or Soviet domination. The
Yeah.
Eastern Europeans did. They felt that much more closely. Now we share those threat perceptions. So I think the fact is that why do we have the relationships we have in our lives? Because we have these commonalities. The authoritarian regimes are very very different. There are no it's ruled by law, not rule of law. So they're happy to use the law when it suits the authoritarians' interests to advance the interests of their kind of like-minded elites, or punish those that are in opposition. They think about they maybe prioritize the collective interests over individual interests, and I think we try to strike that balance here in the U.S. and the West, but we have a strong kind of lean towards individual individual rights and liberties and things of that nature. So that to me explains why, to a certain extent. Now, I want to make sure I don't miss your earlier question, Tunde, about why this matters. Our most important alliances are with the Europeans. When the U.S. was attacked in 2001, and we invoked NATO Article 5, this collective defense protocol, the Europeans were there with us. They rallied in support. The NATO alliance is the most powerful alliance in the world. Think about from an economic basis, the kind of that undergirds national power. The U.S. is almost a $30 trillion economy, although Trump is trying to knock that down a little bit. The Europeans are about a 20 trillion euro economy. That's a $50 trillion basis, roughly, on which to build your economic power, or on which to build your military power. So that we want to preserve those relationships. They are a source of stability.
So it would be in the interest of someone like Vladimir Putin to support an American leadership that would potentially not be as welcoming to maintaining this $50 trillion alliance, right?
Absolutely. I mean, this has been a stated goal of Putin for a couple of decades, really since about the middle of the 2000s. He wants to be able to put the squeeze on states in his neighborhood. He can't do that if they're members of NATO and the EU. Those are too powerful a bloc. So if he could manage to break the NATO alliance and encourage Trump's very, very transactional views that somehow that NATO is putting the U.S. in danger, or NATO is not pulling its weight, he's going to do that in order to achieve this ideal outcome, where the U.S. withdraws and it's then the Europeans, and then maybe the Europeans fracture between East and West because the risks increase that Russia may be a little bit more adventurous with regards to NATO absent the U.S. Than with the U.S. or something of that nature. So it is, why is it? It's not a remote. This is not the Russia-Ukraine war is not something distant. Why do we have a surge in fuel prices? Because the Russians were a source of oil and gas, and that shock to the oil and gas market caused a spike in prices. The Russians, in a kind of a stable, peaceful system, we wouldn't have the same kind of volatility. So and then of course the very, very practical thing: if the Russians were to attack, let's say, a NATO member state like one of the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, we have a collective defense obligation currently. We're a signatory to this treaty that obligates us to, to be involved. Yeah. Now, how we are involved is really up to us, but to be involved. So I think this is this is not a remote threat. It also feeds the Russians, the Chinese views of the world, the Iranians' views of the world, other kind of the North Koreans' views of the world on how aggressive they could be in other critical areas of where we're involved.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, thanks.
So I had a question for you, though. Now, I share a lot of the views that you have in terms of the importance of democratic nations being able to work together to bring their economies together and so forth. I think a lot of that has to do with the shared values of operating under the rule of law, where contracts can be enforced and all that. And also, it does appear throughout history that non-democratic nations see democratic nations as a threat. So if the others are going to be coming at us, then it would be a good idea for us to bundle together because we have that shared concern, so to speak. But I worry, and Tunde and I have talked about this actually, just that are we witnessing possibly the fraying of a post-World War II order due to just entropy? Like that's something that was eventually going to fray because nothing's forever, so to speak. Are we witnessing that, or is this something that you think specific actors in the world right now are, in fact, bringing about? This isn't just some natural decay due to living memory and people prioritizing the right things, or even realism and short-term thinking.
Yeah. So I think I think the living memory component is very, very valid. I think the more distant we are from World War II and the Greatest Generation and their sacrifice and what they were fighting for.
And the clarity of seeing what would happen if this goes wrong.
Right. But I think I don't believe in, in the inevitabilities or kind of fates or something of that nature. I think I put a lot of stock in the agency of individual humans, because I've seen it firsthand. Like,
Mm.
I I guess just as my own personal experience, I reported President Trump's corruption, resulting in the first impeachment that kind of exposed pulled the mask off of good governance, and may have contributed to his loss.
Yeah.
Um, Putin,
Excellent point. Yeah. There's no
Putin,
inevitability there.
yeah,
It's the
yeah.
act of a man.
Putin
Yeah.
has a lot of agency. He's a unique actor in that took a country that was struggling with its democratic orientation and pulled it back into a much kind of more certainly into the authoritarian sphere, um, and an aggressive posture towards the West, when the first decade, maybe 15 years, were about an opportunity to cooperate between East and West, but Russia wanted it on its own terms.
Yeah.
Absent Donald Trump, we would not be witnessing a lot of the things we're seeing. The destruction of different aspects of different institutions,
Yeah.
and it's the confluence of different actors, maybe acting in concert, whether it's intentional or not. The Russians acting as spoilers, funding far right parties, infiltrating and advancing disinformation and feeding these narratives about deep state actors, or what is it that the Russians have all sort. They've got like this spaghetti at the wall approach. Whatever works and kind of divides, breaks confidence in government, feeds conspiracies and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then
No,
you
we've
have,
actually, sorry to interrupt, but we've done a couple of shows on something reported by the RAND Corporation, and it's called the Fire Hose of Falsehood propaganda model.
of course,
Yeah.
And it's you said spaghetti against the wall.
Yeah,
It's
but,
like,
but it's also
just keep
deep.
throwing it up there.
Yeah.
But it's deep because we talk about also back in the civil rights era when they would bring Paul Robeson to try and drive a wedge in American narrative and our own internal discussion, and they would have him saying, "No, there's no segregation here." So the Russians know us very well, our
Yeah.
culture, and how to disturb
absolutely
us.
tons of those
Yeah.
things. But I think Trump shouldn't be underestimated as a unique kind of singular actor
Mm.
that runs really almost diametrically opposed to the traditional kind of Reagan Republican worldview.
Yeah.
Think about the fact that, and one of the organizations I work with, I run a think tank, and I do politics to help get veterans elected. We ran an ad at one point talking about Ronald Reagan and he's giving this famous point to Hawk speech in which he talks about the U.S. role in the world,
Mm.
defeating authoritarianism, advancing democracy. That's the traditional kind of Reagan Republican view, and Trump has kind of turned it on its head.
Yeah.
So I think without Trump, we are in a completely different place. We have more fringe, less relevant actors that are kind of maybe messing around, but not going to drive policy and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, and then what the question that really brings though is the public's appetite towards that. Like, will the public's appetite, because Trump is also very transparent about a lot of these things, and so will the public appetite kind of reset back to more maybe where it was before? Because I know I've just been shocked, as far as like I thought Americans were against autocrats, and then the level of acceptance of it, or people that hold up Orban as like, oh yeah, we want this.
Sure.
Is kind of what we're like. I was just surprised by that people would say that. I assume there were people who thought that, but that they would say it out loud so publicly now.
Well, I think there are some interesting studies that reflect that at any given moment, you'll have like 20% of the population that is happy to embrace authoritarianism because it advances their interests.
Well,
and
also, real quick on that, Alex, what's
I
your
just want to
thought
say
about
it reminds me of a story when I was in Ukraine. The first, like when I had a year posting in Ukraine in 2009 and 10, I remember reading an article. This was heading into an election about like what the Ukrainian leader should be, and the person, there was an older woman, kind of like with nostalgia for the Soviet Union, saying, "We just need a strong man to tell us what to do." It's that kind of thing that I think people are happy to embrace. But the rest of us, understand what that might mean, and what the consequences of a strong man might mean.
Well,
that
let
need
me
for
ask
security.
how how much influence, because you make a great point there, and it's got me thinking, so why, because James has that great question, like why would so many Americans, that's what I was thinking too, like it's Russia. We're close in age, I'm 47, so it's like I grew up under Reagan too and was all proud that we beat the Soviets, right? James and I sometimes talk about this idea, the fire hose of falsehood, its ability, and especially with the way that information can be disseminated through so many different channels now, internet, you can get on your phone, you can get on the TV and all that. The idea of this fire hose of falsehoods creating so much stress in a population that the three of us might say is unwarranted. These things aren't true and all that, but perception's reality. People receiving things that want to believe it. So, for example, I've seen a lot of rhetoric in the last 20 years, really the last decade, bubbling up from places on the right that Russia is the last great white hope, place for white people and stuff. And so the proliferation of things like the great replacement theory that might get enough Americans disturbed enough to say, well, normally I like the idea of a democracy, but kind of like the woman you mentioned about when you mentioned that she said, we just need a strong man, that if people think that their country's being invaded and their culture's being changed purposely by these nefarious forces, and there's a deep state in the government and all this, that they might just say, you know what? Yeah, we need to give up this democracy for a while and just let this guy come in and just vanquish all our foes. I mean, how much of that do you think also plays into it?
I think it plays into it a lot. I think I know the most significant information operation has been one that has sown distrust in our government, and it is not necessarily the biggest part of this is not really the Russians or foreign actors. It's domestically. It's that we have a political party, one of the two political parties that continuously damns public servants, and talks about the fact that they're lazy, corrupt, and has been doing this for decades to advance its kind of interests. That then allows other narratives to kind of seep in and say, well, that makes sense because I don't have confidence in the fact that our leaders are going to do. Congress has one of the lowest approval ratings that it's ever had, like some absurd number, single digits, like 8%. It's because people say that politicians are corrupt, and now that's kind of accepted, that it's the norm. That 65% of the population in a report I read think that Donald Trump is corrupt, but they accept it because he is no more corrupt than any other politician or something of that nature. So I think that it's the lack of trust that is then able to be amplified and directed in a particular towards a particular aim that's been the biggest created the biggest pathway for harm.
It's a slide. I see it's a slide away from, one of the things I think is one of the defining characteristics in your public persona is loyalty to the Constitution, to the document, to the system that is put in place. And what that does is it's very corrosive. Like, people will then turn their back on the Constitution or the system and ask for a person to save them because they're thinking that the document or the system no longer is able to do that. And so I think it's very intentional in terms of making people lose faith in the real structures of what we're all doing here, being the Constitution. But there was one other question I wanted to ask you, because I know we're going to wrap up pretty soon. We
have some time.
But one of the things I was really fascinated by in the book was like how you defined realism. And you mentioned it a little bit earlier, and really the converse of being able to look at things long term, but kind of that connection between the short term and the transactional mindset. My question for you is this: as we're talking about, we're looking backwards at ourselves right now. So is it possible, or to what extent do our elections and the way our campaigning works and so forth promote this kind of realism that we're saying is that could lead us on follies, lead us down the wrong direction? And the reason I ask is because I feel like the voting populace, in many respects, not across the board, but has become, like they've become disconnected. If you're so partisan that you can only look at one party, or even more so, if you're a single issue voter, you're kind of a transactional voter at that point. Yeah. Like you're only in it for the transaction. You're not evaluating the character of a person or anything like that. You're just saying, are you going to give me blank? Okay, then I'll give you my vote. So do we have structural issues, in terms of how we're approaching politics or campaigning that may be pushing us down this path?
I think that our democracy is not keeping pace with the environment.
Mm.
We're now in an environment where we have access to every bit of information we want. We have the ability to. I mean, it's just up to us to really kind of find it and sort it
No,
out.
in information, we've
Yeah.
done a lot of discussions on that information doesn't equal truth. And so
No, it's
I'm
not.
so happy that you use the term information
Yeah.
there, because it's,
Yeah. Yeah. Truth. Truthiness. So it's interesting that I think our democracy is probably not sufficiently responsive to the public. We have presidential elections every 4 years, Senate 6, House 2. What happens in between those cycles?
yeah,
The population doesn't necessarily know. They're not getting talked to about what's being delivered to them with regards to services. And I think one of my fellow grad students, when I was working on my doctorate, was working on this. The fact is, how do you make democracy more responsive?
mhm,
I think that my organization Vote Vets just did something where we had Pete Buttigieg in Iowa, at Cedar Rapids, Iowa, do a town hall to hear the views of veterans and the citizens in the region, to understand what's on their minds. We need to do a lot more of this kind of retail involved connecting,
yeah,
and unfortunately, that doesn't even get you that far, because that was a 1500, 1700 plugged in folks.
mhm,
What about the masses of other folks? They're looking at things, they're looking at their feeds on, basketball or NASCAR or whatever the case might be. How do you connect with folks that are really not interested in plugging in? And that's why we end up with some 90 million people not involved in
yeah,
elections. I talked about this. I gave a speech at Cooper Union, and I took it very seriously because, well, the topic was rebuilding the American dream, and I delivered it speaking at Abraham Lincoln's lectern, where he gave his kind of defining term defining speech in 1860, in which he basically staked out very, very firmly an anti-slavery view
mhm,
that was irreconcilable with the Southern states, and was kind of a weighty place to kind of talk from. And I was thinking about why we're subject to these challenges we are today. It's the dual-edged sword of apathy and complacency.
mhm,
Apathy is the population that doesn't understand what democracy delivers. They're already having a hard time. They're much
yeah,
more interested in what's in providing for their families. They don't necessarily think it could get worse. It's already bad for them. And the complacent, those are the folks that don't see a threat either, and believe that things are fine. Trump is not going to destroy the country. He might deliver another 5 or 10% to their 401ks, and they're fine with that, or they're single issue voters. That's the complacent are those that think about just that one kind of narrow area. What I see happening under the Trump administration is really not that much room for fence sitters, because I see a
yeah,
lot of damage being done. A lot of damage being done right now. A lot of it's focused on the most vulnerable, the undocumented folks um, that don't have a lot of recourse to defend themselves, and that this narrative around attacks from migrants is kind of taken hold and overcome I think the better angels of the American people that want to be helpful. Certainly, they're very focused on their communities and good friends, and support the folks in their communities. But it's the village over, the city over, that's being torn apart by immigration.
yeah,
Um, so to me, I think the fact is that we see the graduation already. Tariffs are going to have an impact, and even though they're temporarily suspended already, some of that shock is hit. There's going to be inflation. Now this attack on Social Security and Medicaid, it is going to make the folks that are apathetic recognize that things can get worse, and it's going to make the folks that are complacent, that thought that Trump was going to deliver for their economic needs, it's going to make things worse. That's why we're seeing these hands-off protests. That's why we're seeing these Tesla protests. So I think that we have an opportunity to seize and channel people power in a way
yeah,
that, to me, is reminiscent of the civil rights movement. that's going to be too hard for Trump, even with his attacks and his efforts to tip the scales in his favor, is going to be too hard for him to overcome. So I tend to see the world, and maybe this is part of the whole neo-idealist view, but kind of domestically oriented rather than foreign policy that I talk about in my book. I think there's an opportunity to basically, focus on the values, and on the back end, leverage that people power to make a correction that doesn't just replace that what was removed, but actually builds back better, to
Yeah.
take care of the things that the population needs. Like, why is the richest country in the world not have something, if not universal healthcare, kind of a much broader access to healthcare? Why
Yeah.
can't we do border security and comprehensive immigration reform? We absolutely need to bring in immigrants. I know, Tunde, you talked about your immigrant parents. I'm a product of, I'm an immigrant myself. We need immigrants in this country because without immigration, this country ceases to grow, the economy ceases to grow, and we start to fall backwards.
Yeah.
So we need that long term. So I think there are, out of this disaster that is the Donald Trump second term, we might have some interesting opportunities if, or we find the leaders that could channel, think through, cast a vision, and develop policies that could take us forward.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up. Just I'm gonna kick it to you in a second, Tunde. But the thing that really stands out to me about that is the talk of the opportunity. Like as you said, complacency and apathy. Well, those things kind of rely on things not being disturbed, and so there actually is an opportunity that's created a lot of time. And a lot of people are worried, and rightfully so. But the snow globe getting shaken up, so to speak, can also be put in your favor if you then can harness the
Hmm.
energy that is created from that. That because that will, as you said, that kind of it's hard to be apathetic or complacent when that happens. So there becomes an opportunity to then to get people's attention and to move things in a direction that you think would be better. So but yeah, I know you had something next to him, Day.
Yeah, no, I mean, I know as we're rounding out to the finish line here, I actually just wanted to get your thoughts about some of the things that are a little bit more current because in the geopolitical side, I find, and I'll just throw a couple things out here and you can
Sure.
grab at a couple of them. One is I find it interesting. I'd like to get your thought as to where we are right now. We are in mid May of 2025 as relates to this whole thing with the ceasefire, the mineral deal, all that, because it seems to me, this is where I find that this could get interesting, that Donald Trump, is transactional, mercurial, and the idea of his close relationship with Vladimir Putin and his desire, at least rhetorically, when he was running for office and after he won the election, saying he wanted to end the war on day one. Clearly, we're on month 4 or 5 of his
Mhm.
presidency, and he seems to be actually getting impatient with Vladimir Putin. And so I know that I'm not going to count on foreign policy via social media posts, but this is the first time I've ever seen Donald Trump publicly distance himself from Vladimir Putin. Do you think
Yeah.
that this is a genuine attempt for Donald Trump maybe to start that he's seeing
Yeah.
Russia for maybe what you've seen for a long time? Or do you
Yeah.
think that this could be some sort of just, another version of psychological warfare from him, just playing games with, with,
I
with everyone?
I think that there are a couple of different factors here. I think, first of all, Donald Trump doesn't do hard. He wanted his easy wins. He wanted peace on day one. He put some effort behind it, put the squeeze on the Ukrainians and the Europeans, really kind of accommodated Russia to get this outcome. And turns out that the Russians don't want peace. And the Ukrainians are willing to compromise a lot, but they're not willing to give away their sovereignty. And they're going to fight on, and the Europeans are going to back them. And the only way to achieve an outcome here is to back Ukraine, put pressure on Russia, get the Europeans to do more, like they already are pledging to do. So I think that what you're seeing, and I actually wrote a piece that came out yesterday morning. Yes, yesterday morning on this, about the peace talks and on my Substack,
Okay.
avindman.com. But basically, and I take a little bit more of a whimsical approach to it, to a very serious topic. uh, I've consistently said that the Russians don't want to cooperate. Trump has delivered too much for them. He's looking to drive these wedges. He's driving these wedges between us and our allies. He's putting the pressure on Ukraine. Russia might not be having success on the battlefield, but Trump is doing a lot of things that are helping them otherwise. So taking the pressure off and ending this confrontation doesn't make a lot of sense for them. The other thing is, to me, it's at this point clear that there are actually other leaders within the Trump administration that don't have the stomach to say anything publicly, are weak-kneed and kind of will publicly rally around Trump, but are also potentially crafty in manipulating Trump also. So what I did was I laid out a case almost kind of satirically in which they're saying, Donald, you are a beautiful, bright man. You will achieve peace in our time with this approach that you've taken towards Putin, extending the hand of friendship and putting the pressure on the Ukrainians. But remember, he's a KGB guy. He might be playing you. So if your first brilliant plan doesn't work, then your second, even more brilliant plan of putting pressure on Putin and supporting Ukraine will surely get us there. So I think you could see some of those lines play out in the way that Trump talks about. He shares starts to share his frustration, but there's a lot of baggage to overcome. There's deep animus towards Ukraine. Vengeance. He blames them instead of me, or blames both of us for his impeachment. He embraces Russia because it's an authoritarian regime. He wants to wield power that way. He thinks a lot of deals. There's a potential for a lot of deals. That's a lot of baggage to overcome. But he wants to be a winner. And if you convince him that the only way he looks like a sucker if he keeps catering to Putin, that says yes, I want peace, but, and that's a big but that obstructs the cause of peace. I think you get him to come over. I describe that as a 6-month process. I wrote about this months ago, and that we're about 4 months in. You could see this kind of relationship with Russia kind of starting to wear. But we might get there to a place where it's at least the status quo. We don't necessarily give the Russians, we don't give the Ukrainians additional aid grants, but they could buy resources, which they've got money to do that. Europeans could buy on their behalf. The U.S. continues to share intelligence. All those types of things could play out in a way that keeps Ukraine in the fight. And I think the Ukrainians have more staying power than the Russians. So the Russians are incentivized to stay on and fight on because Putin's given them a bit of a lifeline. They might stick around for another year, test their luck, even though it's hard. Where we could have maybe ended up in a peace negotiation framework with robust, serious peace negotiation this year. I think Trump has kicked the can down the road, unfortunately, with his approach, his folly. But we might get there.
Yeah, cool. That's interesting. I mean, yeah, I think you say it was satirical, but I think it's been demonstrated a world over that people do believe that flattery is the way to manipulate when it comes to dealing with the U.S. leadership. I think we see that in a lot of places. So I also wanted to ask you, just on a personal level, or we did, when you're not out here, saving the Constitution and fighting for what's right, what do you like to do in your spare time?
So I try to do as much as possible, I guess, on the things that that are important to me. I keep coming back to, on my first day out of uniform, I published an op-ed in the Washington Post, kind of explaining why I was, forced to retire, or retaliation, intimidation. Mm-hmm. My promotion was blocked and all that kind of stuff. But I also kind of I issued a manifesto to myself. I talked about the fact that I wanted to continue to advance U.S. national security. And I do that because I run a think tank, and I write, I wrote this book about policy. I write a Substack. I do lots of media around it. I said I want to advocate for public service because I think public servants are beautiful people. They are oriented on something other than themselves, and they are under attack unfairly. And rallying around public servants and bringing back trust to public service is important. And I said I wanted to advocate for values-based leadership. So that's the stuff I do to help get veterans elected, because I think by and large they adhere to their values and ethics and display physical and moral courage. So I do those types of things. I've got I've got a charity that helps Ukraine advance their defense and war effort. Um, I have a 14-year-old daughter that's going into high school, so I'm trying to spend as much time with her as possible.
There we go.
That's
Um,
good.
I'm in this
That's
community
awesome.
in South Florida, which is what a wonderful place to be. I actually had some doubts because I thought it might be too hard to do my DC work and academia.
Mm.
I've got some academic affiliations with Hopkins. I've done a bunch of I do public speaking and stuff like that. So when I'm not doing a lot of travel, I'm here enjoying a nice home, my family, and in the community, which
Yeah.
I'm really really happy to be a part of.
Oh, that's really cool. Really cool. I mean,
Awesome.
yeah, we all have. Well, Tunde's been a parent a little longer, but he has a young one still, also, and I got
Mhm.
young ones, and yeah, that's always a big thing is trying to spend as much time with them, and then just that family time. So
I got
before we
three
get out,
dogs that keep
we
popping out too. Yeah, I don't know if
Yeah,
you
yeah.
saw some
I
down
saw
the street through here.
them.
Yeah,
so we just want to get. I'm going to also list it in the show notes as well. But just could you tell us anything you'd like to promo? I know you mentioned your Substack. I'll have
sure.
links to the books, but just give us the things you'd like to promo.
Yeah, I'll
And
just
then we can wrap up.
mention a couple things. So I've got a Substack, avindman.com. On the social medias, I work with Vote Vets to help get veterans elected, and Voice Foundation houses my Institute for Informed American Leadership. And I also have something called the Here Right Matters Foundation, which is the title of my first book and
Mm-hmm.
kind of my tagline. Here Right Matters Foundation.org to help Ukraine. But in general, catch me out there. I think I'm pretty approachable, happy to engage and talk and get other people. This has been one of the blessings of a book tour, kind of getting a pulse on how people are thinking across the country,
Mm.
lots of different places. So yeah, I'd like to do that.
No,
Let me
that's
ask
excellent.
you.
I mean, and
What,
that's what free speech is for. For us to
yeah,
get
let
out
me
there
ask
and
you.
speak to each other and so
Mhm.
forth.
Let's end on this. Based on your experience traveling the country with your book tour,
Yeah.
how do you feel based on what you're seeing? Your anecdotal, like, are you optimistic or pessimistic based on your reactions?
I think I still believe that we are a good country filled with good people, a lot of whom are confused. We're
Mm.
340 million people, so 10%, 20% of those not maybe not so good, weren't raised right. That amounts to tens of millions of people. Um, but by and large, we're good people that share common views about what we want to provide for our families. What kind of country we want to live in. And I think that there's an opportunity to wake up from this malaise, this apathy and complacency, and wrestle back our country. I think we do that, over the course of this year's special elections, midterm elections, the presidential, and rally, hem in the worst egregious behavior of the Trump administration, and come back and build back better.
There we go. There we go. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us. Best
Thank
of
you.
luck to you moving forward, and we hope to talk to you again soon.
Looking forward to it. Thanks.
All right.